So if we're going to be effective with the mission of God, we have to understand the context in which we're going to be presenting it. So obviously, to be missional, we have to live out the purposes of God in our time and place. And so we must be a cross-cultural, contextual people. This is a relatively new idea in American churches because we've always considered ourselves to be part of a at least Christian-friendly culture, and of course now that's rapidly changing. And I don't know that it's ever been fully true. We might have assumed too much. But one of the things that we've got to understand is we've got to apply the same principles of teaching that we would if we were in a foreign context, because we are in such a pluralistic culture. And so one of the most important aspects of this whole movement that is, I'm convinced, absolutely true, is that God is already present in every culture. So we must be engaged in culture while not being absorbed by it, and recognize that a lot of the impulses that are in our culture are not by their nature evil. They are just simply energies misguided. So I think about, I've often stated that I am a recovering sports addict. I've given way too much value to something that actually has no meaning. Now, it can have a place in my life, but if it means something and allows me to disparage others based on the hat they wear or the sweatshirt they wear, I've got a problem. But the crazy addiction to the sports culture says something about the needs of people. And it gives us an opportunity to ask the question, what is it that they're seeking to fulfill that might be better fulfilled in the alternative kingdom offered by God's purposes? So we'll look at that. And missional is more than just trying to be relevant in our context. It's demonstrating in ways that can be understood the true nature of life. So it's not so much countercultural, but presenting an alternative culture. So it's not that we're reacting against culture, because there are certain aspects in culture that are very good, and we want to affirm those, but we also want to present a better way to flourish in the context of our lives. So this is a very broad concept, the idea of culture. It's a set of values broadly shared by some subset of the human population. Shared understandings made manifest in act and artifact. In the cultural concept denotes a historically transmitted pattern of meanings, embodied in symbols, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic form by means of which humans communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge and attributes toward life. So culture is a very complex topic that can be defined in a lot of different ways, but we basically understand it as that milieu in which we live. And so it's shared meanings, shared words, shared activities that allow meaning to be transferred. And so the characteristics of culture, basically, it's a society's shared and socially transmitted ideas, values, and perceptions which are used to make sense of experience and generate behavior that are reflected in that behavior. And so there are basically 5 characteristics of culture, one of which, the first, is that it's learned, that a child is born without a sense of culture and is taught what culture is in whatever context they might find themselves in. Culture is shared. It's something that obviously is a pattern of shared meaning. It's based on symbols, and so it's symbiotic. So it's more than just simply words. And if you're familiar with the book series, it's a series of books called Gestures. Some of them are quite comical, but it's how gestures mean such different things in different cultures. And so here are things that are, the same physical action can be deeply offensive in one culture. And so we need to understand what the symbols are. Culture is integrated, meaning it's not something that stands alone. It's something that's integrated in every aspect of our life. And it's dynamic. It's changing. So it's not one of those things that once you understand it, you say, okay, I've got that figured out. It's been interesting to me as a teacher how different the culture on our campus is now than even 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And if you're not aware of the dynamic nature of culture and think that you can simply continue to teach as you've always taught, you're not going to be very effective as a teacher. probably the best known Christian work that for years has had a deep influence on any discussion of culture is H. Richard Niebuhr's work, Christ and Culture. Now, this is a 1951 work, so it's dated, but you'll still see it cited. In fact, there were a plethora of books on culture written in the last 5 years, and the ones that I've read that have to do with Christians understanding culture, all of them reference Niebuhr's work. So this has been highly influential understanding of culture, and he basically suggests that there are 5 different positions we can take. We can take Christ against culture, and that's the idea that Christ is countercultural, and so what we have to do is live the ways of Christ outside of the context of our culture. Then the Christ of culture would be the exact opposite of that, and that's where there is no identification of something apart from culture that is Christ, that culture itself absorbs Christ. We call this, in some ways, liberation theology, where your main concern is being good in a particular culture, but you don't want to change the belief pattern of the indigenous culture. Christ above culture has Christ sitting up over culture as if superior to it, relating to it only as needed for the necessities of life. Christ and Culture and Paradox is the one that most embraced out of Niebuhr's idea, and that's where you have Christ and culture speaking to one another, shaping one another. But again, it's one thing against another. And then you have Christ, the transformer of culture, which seems to be, this would be the one that Niebuhr would say we should all be. But the problem with Niebuhr's work is it overgeneralizes the topic as if these are 2 identifiable aspects, Christ and culture. It's too categorical. Now, it's useful because it created a conversation. It initiated a discussion that continues to this day. But the difficulty with this approach is basically, what is Christ? And there's such a difference of ideas about that in our immediate context. And then what is culture? And there are so many different ideas about what that is, both good and bad. So while Niebuhr's work is helpful, it in a sense, when it comes down to practicing, it's very difficult because we need a deeper definition of terms. And I think Niebuhr suggests and sort of assumes that culture is a bad thing, but it's not. So the best book I've seen on it is written by Andy Crouch called Culture Making. I would highly recommend that you read this book. And his subtitle, Recovering Our Creative Calling, especially those of you who work in youth ministry. I think you would find this particularly helpful. But what Crouch says basically is that culture at its worst is humans taking on the role of cultural strategists, attempting to provide themselves meaning apart from God, provide meaning and purpose. And so this is self-made culture. Think of the Tower of Babel, the whole idea of rebellion against God, not wanting to live for the purposes of God, humankind wanting to establish itself as an independent identity. Culture at its best, though, is at the hands of Christ. The sheer delight and joy that comes when Jesus takes the most basic stuff of the world, breaks it, blesses it, and offers it back to us. Make whole and made whole and made new. This is a really exciting understanding of culture that we can't avoid it. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But what Andy Crouch wants us to do is sort of rethink what culture is. And so it gets a bad rap because we define it poorly. It's that which calls us away from Christ, I've heard it called. But again, it's a necessary outgrowth of intentional creativity. And if someone says, I don't want to participate in culture, the fact that they're using words, it's too late. This is not optional. And so Genesis 1 presents this idea that God is ordering the world in a way for us to function. In a sense, that's what culture is. It's our ordering of our world. Now, obviously, it can be misguided. But as I mentioned here, some anthropologists propose that art's the first of human professions, that it expresses culture, that humans are made to create culture. It's the essence of who we are. And so storytelling is a form of expressive art. So narratives are necessary for cultural meaning to be handed on. And so culture is obviously something that we cannot avoid. And so God made, created, he's purposeful, engaged, creative intelligence at work. Genesis 1, again, is a sequence of ordering. Creation cannot exist without ordering. Humanity is created as creative cultivators. And so they take the raw elements given in creation and begin to form and reshape the world, and that's what we know as culture. And so culture is what we make of the world. We are, by design, culture makers. Now, this has really had an influence on my thinking. When I first began to teach strategies in emerging culture, I didn't even have the language for missional when I began this course, but it was the idea of evangelism. I did not take into consideration the idea of us as believers in Jesus having the opportunity to reshape the world around us by introducing an alternative culture. And that's such a deeper, more robust understanding of what God calls us to do, than simply using words or methods to talk about religion. There's a much greater calling here. And so what Andy Crouch says is we make sense of the world by making something of the world. The human quest for meaning is played out in human making. The finger painting, omelet stirring, chair crafting, snow swishing activities of culture. Meaning and making go together. Culture, you could say, is the activity of making meaning. And so we'll talk about things like cultural artifacts, which are simply those things which are the result of the culture in which we're living. So this would bring us to a really interesting self-evaluation. It is what are we creating as cultural goods by the lives that we are living. And so that's the ultimate challenge before us, that we are given control or given a culture in which we are to live over which we have no control, the larger culture. And if we stay with the briefest definition, shared understandings made manifest in act and artifact, we immediately become contributors to culture, which is not static but dynamic. And the biblical story calls us to a specific function in culture, and that is to order it as God wills by ordering our lives accordingly. This is missional living. I really like this definition. It's exciting that we have every day we wake up with the opportunity to demonstrate the ordering of our lives in a way that demonstrates the power of God. So we are culture makers by design. We are influencing our culture as we live out our lives. So again, culture is not optional. Our negotiating the need for culture would be similar to a fish negating the need for culture would be similar to a fish negating the need for water. We can't live without culture. We wouldn't have language, we wouldn't have ways of communicating. So the question is not, are we for it, against it, or trying to affirm it, or trying to condemn it? This is where Niebuhr got it wrong, because for him, culture was a negative element of life. The problem is seeing culture as an it or an object that we can objectify. It's actually, instead, the horizons of the possible and the impossible in very concrete, tangible ways. It defines it. And so the bigger question is, what is our cultural task? Now, this brings us back to something I talked about in our previous presentation, and that is each individual lives in two stories. Your first order story is your own personal narrative, unique to you, and then you're going to influence a community of some form that gives meaning back to your life. And this is what culture making is. It's what we participate in providing meaning for our lives. And so that cultural narrative is going to determine the value of your first order life, and so your first order story. And so the way that this works is it's really important for us to understand that while this is faith, it's not faith versus reason, because faith is expressed as a story that provides value, and what wakes you up in the morning is that worldview, the way in which you see the world, which are based on presuppositions. I'll get into that in just a moment. I want to stop here and discuss this because I think this is a really important part of what we're going to do in this course. The way that culture works is it identifies values for you that you by nature then pursue. So culture is giving us a second order story that tries to give us a reason to live, so that when we wake up as individuals with our contributing aspect, which again I would call our first order story, We have energy that we have stored through our rest. We have abilities that are going to be expressed through our work, and we're going to spend that economy. By economy here, I'm just saying look at your life as a resource of activities. You make the choices on what you're going to think about, how you're going to spend your time, how you're going to spend your money, how you're going to interact with others. And there is an unspoken second order story that you are participating in. There's a narrative that is dictating to you or shaping how you think and what you're doing. And it's that narrative that we want to identify. Because I know a lot of people who call themselves Christians who, by the way that they live their lives, look an awful lot like secular materialists. Those are competing worldviews. And so this identifying our meta-narrative then allows us to reconsider the values that we should have. And if we don't have those values, we have to ask ourselves the question, why? So everyone in the world is living by faith in some narrative. And I'm teaching a class right now called Faith and Culture. It's an undergraduate class, used to be apologetics. But one of the things I want to point out is we don't need to feel that we are at a disadvantage because we are people of faith if a student is a Christian. Everyone lives by faith in something. You have a belief system that you have given your life to, and you're going to spend the values, you're going to spend the activity of your life pursuing the values that that particular narrative identifies. Now, I was talking to them about, our first class was this last Monday. I said, obviously, all of you are here to learn. Why? Why are you pursuing a particular vocation? Well, the prevalent story in our culture says we're here to learn because we want to make money, because that's what we need to flourish. But I said, because we are a Christian institution, we believe there's a much greater reason to live and to learn, because we believe that God has created you to participate in making the world a better place, and we want to help shape what that looks like so that you have a much higher motivation to learn than simply making money. Because in that worldview, what you can do is you can cheat your way through and miss the point of really learning, because your ultimate outcome is that you want to make more money, and so it's all about success in the world. And it speaks very little to your particular participation in that larger story in any way other than to say, I'm here to make money, and if that means I have to run over somebody else, so be it. But if we're going to train you into your profession as a part of what God is doing to order the world, then that opens up all kinds of possibilities for learning that would not otherwise be there. And I tell my students quite often, I don't think there's any greater story that you can come up with than this. Listen, you wake up in the morning with a realization that you have time and opportunity before you to shape the world in a way that will glorify the Creator itself. That you're waking up into a participation with the Creator to make the world a better place. There's no greater value in life than that. And it's not dependent on how much money you have or how smart you are. It's dependent on your willingness to be faithful to the call of God. And so the problems that we need to confront is that all of these things are based on presuppositions. Presupposition is simply something you believe to be true. There are two kinds. There are theoretical and non-theoretical. Theoretical are presuppositions that you've studied through, and so you have confidence that those are true. Non-theoretical are simply assumed presuppositions. This is the way most people live. So why would this be important to a study of missional theology and strategizing to proclaim the gospel? I think we have to start with identifying the fact that we have made presuppositions of the world and of our own lives that are not based on the purposes of God. So we need to rethink this. And this is a real challenge. And so this brings us to what our next unit will be about. And notice that some units are 2 weeks long, some units are 1 week long. This is a 1 week long unit, meaning that I'll post another integrity discussion next week. And that discussion will be a 2 week long unit. We've got 16 weeks to do 12 units. And so there'll be some weeks that are 2 weeks long and some weeks that are 1 week long. Usually I try to organize that around the content and the amount of time it takes for the reading of the material that I'm asking you to read. So we're trying to keep our hours appropriate to the course itself. But what I want us to begin with next week is laying down the foundation for a theology of creation that allows us to see the mission of God from the very beginning. And so this is Goheen's book, A Light to the Nations, and I've asked you to read particular the first 120 pages, whatever that specific assignment is. But in this, what I want us to consider is that you have God creating with a purpose in mind. The idea of telos is that it has a purpose in mind, and that humankind is created in the image of God to form and fill creation, to flourish. Again, inherent in that is the idea of being culture makers. So we are created by a creator to continue to create, and we co-create with God through whatever work that we do. And so the purpose of life is to partner with God in continuing his creative work through us. So God continues to dynamically create through us. So we have to ask ourselves, is what we're doing with our hands consistent with the purposes of God in the world? Now, in this story then, sin is the invader of God's purposes. It's that which comes into the narrative to disrupt the activity of God. So it's not just breaking God's law, it's refusing to live. Borrowed that from N.T. Wright. It's the idea that this is going against the ordering of God for life, and so it's a self-focused life versus the God-focused life. Then Jesus Christ, the Anointed One, comes to redeem us back into the life ordered after the purposes of God, which again I would suggest to you is a really good definition for missional living. And so what this does is it refocuses our understanding of the purposes of the biblical story. Again, this is what we'll begin considering next week. We need to know the story of God in such a way that we can appropriately navigate our lives in the context of that story. Okay, that sounds a bit condescending and maybe even sounds like I'm assuming too much. But this is my experience with churches. It's very difficult to convince someone they're supposed to live out the mission of God when they don't understand the story of God in which that fits. And so this calls us to a different way of reading Scripture. And we'll talk about a missional hermeneutic through this entire study because it invites us to read the story of God differently. And I'll tell you, I've read Scripture all my life in some way, shape, or form, but it means more to me now than it's ever meant as I more deeply understand the mission of God that I'm being invited into. And so Chris Wright wrote a magnificent book, which I highly recommend. It's 600 plus pages, so it's going to take a hunk of time to read, but it's worth it. And it's called The Mission of God. But the idea is that we find our place in this wonderful missional narrative, and that what Wright proposes is a missional reading of Scripture, which changes the way we absorb and pursue that which is in Scripture. Because the question that we often ask is, how am I supposed to fit God into my life? But that's not the question. The question is, where do I? And I'm not trying to make us feel small here as much as make us feel relevant. Where does my little story fit into God's story? What is the purpose of my life in God's purposes? Not how can God fit into the flow of my life. No. What is God doing that I can join him with? And, the idea of joining God where he's already at work is a deep missional principle. How do I live in the reality that's presented by Scripture as the true life to which I am invited? And that also asks the question, how do we read the Bible in such a way that we understand that true life to which we're invited? So what kind of church then does God need for his mission? So it's not how does a church get involved in missions. It's what kind of church do we need to be fully pursuing God's mission? And that's the question I want to ask. It's not how can the church do some little thing in the community that will be seen as a good thing so that people think good about the church. This is not an ecclesiocentric reading of Scripture. It's God. It's Christ-centered. And so how does the church represent God's mission to order the world in ways that ultimately will allow it to flourish? And so it's not what kind of mission has God have in store for me? It's what kind of me does God need for his mission? And I think you would have to admit that this is a totally different way of approaching mission, because it's no longer leaving me in control, but asking that I fully submit to the purposes of God that are presented in the context of my culture. And so here's what I really hope that we can do in terms of the purpose and the focus of this. Just a couple of more slides and we'll be done with this first week's presentation. I want us to identify a biblical view of the world, and that is that we understand what it is that God is wanting to do with his creation, and understand then God's missional essence, that is Missio Dei. We understand the heart of God and God's activity in the world. We want to identify a biblical theology of mission, which allows us then to identify and pursue the nexus, that is the connection of the God-human partnership in Missio Dei, and that is the mission of God again. So we want to identify a theology that allows us then to identify what our participation is in God's mission in the world. So we will identify a mission, a theology of mission. That's our first paper that we'll be working on, and I'm encouraging you to go ahead and get started on maybe some of the basic outlines of thought as you read Goheen. We want it to be something we can consciously and fervently pursue. Okay, big statement here, but I would intend for this first paper, a theology of mission, in some sense to serve as a basis for the activity of ministry that you will be involved in for the rest of your life. This is an opportunity for us to be very focused on establishing a foundation that will allow us to pursue the purposes of God in everything that we do and say. I want us to be able to verbalize awareness of the cultural changes that provide exciting opportunities for God's mission. Identify and develop the organizational skills needed to plan kingdom expanding efforts wherever one is working. So this gets to the praxis part, that is where we put it into practice. And I know that you all represent a fairly diverse context in which each of you are working. And I think the wonderful thing about this course is it does not insist that you be in a particular context for it to have relevance. I think this is relevant in any particular culture you might be finding, or position, whatever your position might be. I want you to evaluate that as an opportunity to be expressive in the pursuit and to be effective in the pursuit of the mission of God through your life. Recognize and pursue the role of spiritual leadership and the calling of all believers to full participation in Missio Dei. I'm very passionate about this, because it seems to me this is one of the greatest things missing in the church, is the idea that every person has a role in the mission of God. And it's not that we don't have enough activities in the church. I think the activities are oftentimes misdirected. So there's got to be a better way of calling people into activity that actually gives them life, because God created them for that very thing. So we need to have the ability to coach and cultivate missional imagination in the mind of all members in the community of faith. Now, those are objectives that I'm very serious about. I will try to measure those through the course and at the end of the course. And you may want to go back and refer to these on a fairly regular basis so that you see what we're doing as we work through the content of the course. All right, so your assignments then. After listening to today's two lectures, lecture A and B, I'm asking you to submit a journal entry through Blackboard concerning this unit. I'll post these slides immediately after this recording. And so just asking questions, what do you learn? What questions do you have? If you have deep concerns and you want to write me personally, then go through normal email, because sometimes I get those more quickly. I don't read your journal entries usually until the end of the week. So the journal entry, again, it's not to make me feel good about myself. I don't need that. I need to know what you're learning and what questions you might have. Now, you need to also respond to the thread of discussion that will be posted that has to do with content in today's presentation. So answer that first thread, respond to 2 of your classmates' posts. Oops, clicked the wrong click. Then be prepared to consider Goheen, those first 120 pages, in preparation for next week. And now your review for the entire book is due next week on well, 24th. So that's a couple of weeks, 2 weeks from today. I'm recording this on Wednesday. And so I'll want that review turned in again on Blackboard. By the way, I'm trying to learn how to have work submitted on Blackboard, because we're required to allow an auditor to look at the work. They won't be looking specifically at the content of your work, but they will be looking to see that you've gotten it done. And so I used to have all work turned in as email attachments, which is much easier. And I might have to go back to that because I'm trying to figure out exactly how to manipulate these Blackboard modules for work submission. But for now, do your best to attach it to the book review module. If you have problems with that, just email me. But I look forward to the study with you. It's one that I'm committed to. It's one that I continue to study. I have great interest in it. I'm looking forward to learning from you. Help me keep this interesting. While this may not be the best format, it's the one that we're going to use. So let's do our very best to benefit from it. I think the content of the course and the readings that you'll have to do make the course worth its weight. But the discussion that we can have around it could really be helpful in the specific application of these principles to your ministry life. So may God bless you in His ministry, and I look forward to interacting with you through the various modules of the course, and I'll be ready to make a presentation again next week for Unit 2.